You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
We are joined today by Mark Olshaker, author of too many books to count at this point, writing partner with John Douglas. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kristin. Always good to be here.
Can you actually give us a count of how many books you've written at this point?
Let's see. With John, I think we've done like 10 or 11 now. I'm not quite sure. Something like that.
And then on your own, you've written a number of books as well.
Yeah, I've written 5 novels and a couple of other nonfiction books.
And I know when I talked to you the other day, you said you're working on one with Dr. Osterholm right now, again on the pandemic.
We're doing another book, a sequel to the one we put out in 2017, Deadliest Enemy, War Against Killer Germs, which actually, I have to say, our chapter on coronavirus was called SARS and MERS, Harbingers of Things to Come. We're doing another book now about what we've learned and haven't learned from COVID and how we can apply that, we hope, to the next inevitable pandemic. So yeah, sex, violence, and pestilence. That's what I do.
On the first page of that one should just be, "We told you."
Yeah, I know, but people don't like to hear that, unfortunately.
Although it probably is good for all of us to hear you summarize some of what I hope we've learned from this recent pandemic. I shouldn't even refer to it in the past tense.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things, the only thing we really didn't predict and didn't talk about in Deadliest Enemy, and the thing that really surprised us the most, was what I would just call the non-compliance. I thought everybody would want to pull together on this common threat. Almost we would expect humanity to pull together if there was an alien invasion. We were just surprised that they didn't, that it became so politicized that people would act against their own best interests just because of a political view they'd taken. And the other thing is, I think from both sides, from both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, I have to say I'm very disappointed in the public messaging, the messaging from CDC and from NIH and others. We really need to develop a strong sense of humility about what we know and don't know and just be prepared. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons, and I think we're still processing them. And people often ask me, what's the connection between the writing you do about public health and the writing you do about criminal justice? And I say they're both mystery stories and about killers who are lurking there when we least expect them. And they're both detective stories. And I think they're all crime and disease are always going to be with us. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for the detectives and investigators in both of those fields who try to get ahead of the problem.
Mark, we wanted to bring you in today to talk a little bit about John Hinckley, who has been in the news recently because he has been released from all court oversight with relation to his role in the near assassination of Ronald Reagan. For any of our listeners who may not be aware, because we do have international listeners and we also have some younger listeners, can you just tell us very quickly who John Hinckley Jr. actually is?
Yeah, John Hinckley Jr. was a young man on March 30th, 1981, who waited outside the Washington Hilton Hotel after new President Ronald Reagan was giving a speech. He came out one of the lower entrances to his waiting limousine with his press secretary, James Grady, and a couple of other aides and his coterie of guards and Secret Service agents. And John Hinckley came up to him and fired into the group, seriously injuring Jim Grady. He never worked again from that day on. And it turns out when they got into the limousine and they rushed off, they found out that President Reagan had been seriously injured. He was taken to George Washington University Hospital emergency room, where we found out later he almost died. John Hinckley was arrested. He was put on trial for attempted murder and assassination, because that is a federal crime. And it turns out that his whole attempt was he wanted to impress the actress Jodie Foster, who he'd first seen in the movie Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro. And he thought that somehow if he committed this dramatic act and had her come away with him, she would be impressed and he would win her affection. Through that, he was, I suspect, through that and through some probably good representation, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to St. Elizabeth Hospital for the mentally ill at that time, and where he remained for several decades, eventually being allowed some limited privileges, then being allowed to go to his parents' home in Williamsburg, Virginia, and as Kristin said, most recently being deemed completely recovered, maintained, sane, whatever you want to call it, and allowed to go about his business. He's now in his 60s, I believe.
Yes.
Before we get into Hinckley and some of the mechanics involved, it seems to me the Secret Service has been back in the news recently. I don't feel like a president in 2022, regardless of who the president might be, would be exposed in the same way that President Reagan was on the steps of a major hotel.
I think you're probably right, Bill, but things have gotten tighter and tighter as we've gone along. It's unimaginable now to think that a president could be exposed the way President Kennedy was on November 22nd, 1963, riding in a somewhat hostile city of Dallas, Texas, in an open-top limousine. That's just in a slow-moving motorcade. That's unthinkable today. During the Clinton administration, the Secret Service closed off Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House to avoid truck bombs or car bombs. More and more things have happened like this. If you remember, since this has also been in the news, President Trump wanted to go to the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, after his incendiary speech near the White House, and the Secret Service said that he couldn't go. In fact, he also wanted the magnetometers taken away from the site where he was speaking so that more and more people of his followers could be let in. The Secret Service, of course, were trying to keep all weapons out. Trump didn't seem to care about that because he thought that the weapons were not aimed at him. Yeah, I think there's been tighter and tighter security as we've gotten more sophisticated about what's going on in this country. And look, we are a violent country. There was a mass murder in Copenhagen, Denmark, just this past week. Now, what's interesting is Copenhagen has 1/24 of the mass murders that we do, according to my latest information. But we're seeing things all over the place now.
I know sometimes, too, the presidents have surprised the Secret Service with impromptu jumping out of limousines and that sort of thing. I know that in the example you just brought up, President Trump didn't want the magnetometers used because he wanted a larger crowd. But I also remember President Obama jumping out and walking around the mall. And I'm sure it gave his Secret Service detail.
You can only do a certain amount. But I felt the same way when I saw that scene of Obama, Bill. I said, this is crazy.
As a citizen, I liked it because I thought, wouldn't it be cool to see the president and be able to interact with the president closely? But from a Secret Service details perspective, they had to be having a cow.
Yeah. The Secret Service has been criticized a lot of late, sometimes validly, sometimes not validly. But yeah, it's an increasing problem as our country becomes more and more politicized, more and more diverse in its political views, and people are just angry.
So prior to attempting to assassinate Reagan, Hinckley had actually stalked President Jimmy Carter, and he had stalked Jodie Foster in that 7 months prior to actually shooting President Reagan. Does the Secret Service have an awareness of those sorts of things? Would they have been aware that Hinckley was a stalker, or did that only come out later?
They try to, and this is not unusual. Most assassins really are not focused as much as you would think on the object of their violence. It's more about making a name for themselves, feeling some kind of importance. I can say with I think without any exception, all of the assassins that I can think of have been deeply troubled individuals, very inadequate, feeling that they had to make their statement somehow. John Hinckley thought that by killing Reagan, that he would impress Jodie Foster. Why he thought that remains under discussion. But Arthur Bremer, who tried to assassinate Governor George Wallace when Wallace was running for president on a third-party ticket in 1972, and he got him at a shopping center in Laurel, Maryland. Wallace was paraplegic for the rest of his life and in pain after that. But what's interesting is Bremer had nothing particular against Wallace. He had first stalked President Nixon and stalked him for several months. But because of the Secret Service, he was never able to get close enough to Nixon to do anything. He switched to an easier, less hardened target. All of these guys, almost all of these guys, with the exception of a couple like Sarah Jane Moore and Squeaky Fromm, both of whom were Manson family members who tried to assassinate President Ford. Almost all of these others are men. Almost all of them come from backgrounds that were not optimum in one way or another. They almost all kept diaries and lists of their grievances. So these are pretty much unfocused, angry young men who look for a focus for their grievance or something to make them stand out, to make them important. Even somebody like Mark David Chapman, who assassinated John Lennon. John Lennon was an international celebrity. Chapman was a nobody. But if Chapman had power over Lennon, he became a somebody in his own mind.
I want to jump back to Kristin's earlier question for a second, Mark. I know you were crediting the Secret Service, who deserve the credit for keeping our public figures safe. When you say that the Secret Service was able to head off some of these assassinations, does that mean then that those individuals who may have thought of attempting those assassinations move on to the radar of the Secret Service? Or
a lot of them do. The ones you don't hear about are all the people that the Secret Service keeps track of, and there are hundreds of them, if not thousands. I was involved in a situation once where I contacted the Secret Service about somebody who I thought, from communications with me, I thought might have been a threat. And the Secret Service said, yeah, we know about him. Thanks.
Yeah, so this is someone we are aware of and on some level we're tracking or whatever.
Do you know if this has always been a bit of a rumor that goes around Williamsburg because, of course, Hinckley spends a lot of time here in Williamsburg, more so now. Does Secret Service still keep track of John Hinckley?
I'm sure they do.
I've never been able to get confirmation one way or the other.
You won't get that confirmed, but I'm sure they do.
I wasn't sure if is there a Secret Service person on him at all times?
And I suspect that his release was not an arbitrary time. I believed he would not be released until Nancy Reagan died, and then after that.
Oh, very interesting.
What's sad then is that James Brady has died.
Yes, he has.
As well. And Kristin and I talked about this. You could make a case that Hinckley is directly responsible for Jim Brady's untimely demise.
Yes, you could. The problem is, since he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, that would be a very hard case to make.
So what are the criteria required to find someone not guilty by reason of insanity? Does that have something to do with the McNaughton?
This is very interesting and very relevant, unfortunately. This really goes back to the McNaughton case in Britain in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Daniel McNaughton, sometimes spelled McNaughton, had some grievances against the British government and tried to assassinate the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, outside the Prime Minister's official residence. He ended up not being able to assassinate Peel, but was able to kill his private secretary. He was put on trial, and he was found essentially not guilty by reason of insanity. The McNaughton rule, which came out into British common law, essentially said two things. Somebody is not guilty by reason of insanity if, number one, he does, and we always use the term he because overwhelmingly the offenders we're talking about are male. The two issues are he does not know the difference between right and wrong, and number two, cannot conform his behavior to the dictates of society. Now, there have been many reinterpretations since then, but that is essentially still the insanity defense today. We talk about a doctrine known as the policeman at the elbow. And the doctrine states that if there is a uniformed policeman at the scene of the crime and the criminal goes ahead and commits the crime anyway, he is probably insane. If the uniformed police officer's presence deters him from the crime, then he is probably not insane. Now, that's a very simple explanation. The next thing that always comes up in these discussions when I explain this is they say, don't you have to be crazy to kill somebody in cold blood as opposed to self-defense or anything like that? And the answer is, crazy doesn't mean anything to the law.
Okay.
Is somebody mentally ill who does that? Most likely they are. I can't think of many cases where somebody would commit cold-blooded murder or attempt to and not be mentally ill. However, mental illness and insanity are two different things. Mental illness is a very vague psychiatric term. Insanity is a legal term which has to do with your ability to comport yourself according to the dictates of society. In other words, somebody who is delusional may or may not be insane. Somebody who is hallucinatory most likely is. So I would submit to you that somebody like John Hinckley, while certainly mentally ill, I don't think he was insane by any stretch of a reasonable approach to the law.
Yeah, I remember reading that he was found to have schizophrenia and major depressive disorder. So do you feel like the insanity defense wasn't warranted there?
I absolutely feel it wasn't. I saw no indication then or now that he ever suffered from schizophrenia, which is a shattered personality. One hears voices, one has delusions and sometimes hallucinations. He probably did have some kind of depressive disorder, but that again does not conform to the definition of insanity. He knew right from wrong. He was able to conform his behavior. Also, he planned this. He knew exactly what he was doing. You could say that there's some very irrational behavior. The idea that he was going to impress a beautiful, famous actress into going off with him by killing the president, that's certainly irrational. One could call it delusional, whatever you want to say. But that's not insane. He didn't have to do it, and he knew it.
But many of us civilians use these terms interchangeably, don't you think,
Yeah,
Mark?
I know. Look, we all use the term crazy. We say that's a crazy idea or whatever. But my point is that insanity has, over the last 3 centuries, had a very specific legal connotation. And in my view, obviously the jury disagreed with me, but in my view, John Hinckley was not insane at the time, nor has he been. I think he was obsessional, certainly. He certainly had mental problems, but those don't excuse what he did, particularly to Jim Brady.
So the more appropriate punishment, in your view, would have been life in prison?
Absolutely.
No, I tend to agree with you on that. So in 2005, they started loosening restrictions on him at St. Elizabeth. And that was the first time that I remember as a citizen of Williamsburg hearing they're going to let John Hinckley come home. They're going to let him visit his parents. And then just 3 weeks ago, as we said at the top of the pod, he was freed from all court oversight. Do you feel like that's the right call to make? Should he be freed from court oversight?
I think the psychiatrists and the officials were in a bind, because if he had been declared not guilty by reason of insanity and he was no longer insane, which I don't think he was to begin with, what is your logic for holding him in prison? So I think this was a miscarriage of justice to begin with. Had he been, look, Sirhan, who assassinated Robert Kennedy, certainly had the same kind of mental instability as John Hinckley, but he was found sane and guilty, and he's still in prison where he has been since spring of 1968. I don't have a good solution for what you do with a John Hinckley now. Had there been what I would consider a reasonable jury verdict, I think that he would still be in prison and it wouldn't be an issue. Now, let me say at the same time, I have read the judge's instructions many times. They are so complicated and so convoluted based on both defense and prosecution. But I would think a jury of laymen would be very confused by this, and they probably gave him the benefit of the doubt. I think a better case maybe could have been made explaining just exactly what the insanity defense is, because as you both know from your own research in criminology, the insanity defense doesn't work very often. It's invoked a lot, but most juries are not willing to let killers out on that basis. And they really worry that if you don't convict somebody, then it's an open question about when they're going to be back on the street again.
It feels like the holy grail for a lot of defense attorneys.
Sure.
Like they're going to try it, but they're not likely to succeed. And as you said a moment ago,
in my most recent book with John Douglas, When a Killer Calls, about the Larry Jean Bell murder case in South Carolina in the mid-1980s, what this man did to these two victims, one a 17-year-old girl just graduating from high school, and then 2 weeks later, a 9-year-old girl, both of whom he abducted, sexually violated, and then killed in horrible fashion. The defense was, okay, he did it. Clearly, this guy's insane, and the way he was acting out in court. But again, the prosecution was able to prove, with John Douglas's help, that while this guy was bizarre, while he was certainly mentally unstable, he knew exactly what he was doing. He planned it. He planned his escape. He planned not getting caught. He hid the bodies, all of these things. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. We have to make a distinction between mental illness and insanity.
And there was a lot of
mental illness itself is not an excuse.
And when you see tons and tons of rational behavior by the killer or killers, there are clearly an ability to make decisions which will minimize the opportunity for them to get caught,
Bill, I don't
punished, etc.
I don't want to get really personal here, but whoever it was who killed your sister, by the mere fact that he was able to get away, is not insane.
And they're still wandering around 35 years later.
Was rational, able to plan and carry out his evil.
No question about it. I also think sometimes juries fear letting someone out. In other words, I think
they should.
Yeah, on some level you have to say to yourself, if you're a citizen who's been chosen for a jury, after sitting through days, weeks, sometimes even months worth of testimony, on some level, I think the thought must cross the minds of every juror. Do you want this person back out in society with the opportunity perhaps to reoffend? And some of these people are people that could easily cross over to whatever their darkest behaviors represent.
Absolutely. And from my experience, juries take their responsibilities very seriously, particularly in capital cases or murder cases or violent crime of any sort. I think they really do. And they are very aware of victims and potential victims. So, yeah, I agree with it.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
You'd mentioned Sirhan a couple of minutes ago, who, for the benefit of our listeners, assassinated Robert F. Kennedy in 1968.
At point blank range, by the way.
At point blank range, yeah. Is the only difference between his case and John Hinckley's the fact that he succeeded where Hinckley failed?
I think that's a large part of it, yes.
Do you feel like it would be appropriate to let Sirhan out of prison this many years on? I know RFK's son even was saying, hey, I think it's time to let this guy out. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I would say you don't let him out. Or maybe a more glib way of putting it is, let him out when Robert Kennedy is brought back to life. This brings up a very interesting and difficult philosophical point, Kristin. There are traditionally three pieces of logic for imprisonment. One is rehabilitation, which we've all heard about. The other is punishment, which we all know about. And the third is simply warehousing. In other words, if somebody is dangerous, you just have to keep them off the street. And the emphasis on these three goals changes with the public opinion and how the crime rate and things like that. Rehabilitation is a nice idea when it can be done. I would submit that almost no sexual predators can be rehabilitated. That's my own opinion based on my research and experience. Warehousing, I think that if you take somebody like Sirhan, or let's say the remaining members of the Manson family, there is no need to warehouse them now. None of them are going to be dangerous on any level. They're all in their 70s at this point. So the third element is punishment. And I would say I don't know about Sirhan because he's now saying he doesn't know whether he committed the crime or not. But the remaining members of the Manson family, they all understand what they did. They have had 40 years or more to sometimes 50 years to reflect on what they did on that horrible 2 nights in the summer of 1969 in Los Angeles. On the other hand, I've studied the cases. I've seen the crime scene photos. I've seen the horrible things that these people did, how they stabbed a 9-month pregnant Sharon Tate to death, wrote on the walls with her blood. And some things just can't be forgiven, I'm afraid. And while I think that these people all have understood the error of their ways, I don't think they're dangerous anymore. I don't want to let them out of prison because there are some things that are just too horrible to forgive. If there is an afterlife, then that's taken care of in the next world. I don't think we have the capacity or facility to take care of it in hours. All we can do is balance the scales to the extent that is humanly possible. No, I don't want Sirhan out. I agree with Governor Newsom. Don't want the Manson family members out. And had John Hinckley been convicted, as I think he should have been, I think he should have spent the rest of his life in prison, as should Mark David Chapman and other assassin personalities.
So that just leads me back to, Mark, how in the world is John Hinckley Jr. being allowed to wander around Williamsburg, Virginia, essentially unsupervised?
Yeah, I don't think I would be very surprised if the Secret Service is not keeping track of him, at least on a surreptitious or unofficial basis, since he was declared not guilty with the caveat that he was insane, and he no longer is, since again, I think he never was. I don't know what else you can do. If it were me and he jaywalked, I'd pick him up. But
the whole thing's preposterous. Just to review, he wounded 2 police officers. He shot and nearly killed President Reagan, a sitting president. He paralyzed Jim Brady, a key member of the president's staff. And as we discussed a few minutes ago, I definitely believe, as a big fan of Jim and Sarah Brady's, that he shortened Mr. Brady's life.
Unquestionably. Not only that, but I happen to know from some inside sources how hard and how difficult Jim's life was after that. The only person I've talked to about this in the Reagan family is their daughter, Patty. And I know she certainly doesn't think he should have been let off with an insanity plea and eventually let out. And I know she knew that how this affected her mother for the rest of her life.
Oh my gosh, it's just a thing of nightmares. And Kristin and I talk about this, and Kristin keeps thinking she's going to run into Hinckley at one of the area bookstores that she frequents.
Because he frequents there too. People actually keep tabs on where does this guy go. We know he goes to Sweet Frog, Antiques Market, the bookstore that I like.
And then the other issue is he's going on this music tour, this concert tour. And I understand he's selling out in some places. I think I'm enough of a First Amendment defender, and since he's not actually doing things having to do with the assassination, the Son of Sam laws don't apply to him. I really question anybody who would pay money to see this free.
Yeah, that for context, for any of our listeners who aren't aware, a federal judge did rule in 2020 that John Hinckley could showcase and market his artwork, his writing, which is bad, and his music, which is not great either, under his own name. He now has a YouTube channel where he posts videos of himself performing his original songs and then covers of other songs. He is selling out concert halls, although his Brooklyn concert recently had to be canceled due to security concerns. Should he be allowed to profit from his artwork and his music?
Again, many states, and I don't know if the District of Columbia or Virginia are among them, have what's called Son of Sam law, that a convicted criminal cannot profit by anything having to do with his crime, since my understanding is that for these songs or artwork don't have to do directly with the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan and the wounding of Jim Brady and several others, that this would not fit under the Son of Sam rules. So yeah, I think this is one of those things where I would absolutely defend his right to do this, and I would just as vociferously condemn anybody who supports it. I guess that's a little weird, but that's how I feel.
I just find the whole thing so infuriating.
Maybe is insane a word that would maybe come to mind?
But here we go again, talking like civilians.
It's certainly crazy. Yeah.
It is crazy, and it's offensive. And the idea that
unfortunately,
someone would want to put a
fortunately in our country, I haven't decided which, being offensive is not a crime.
I'm afraid not, but wow. It's a crime against
horrible. The sense, but not a crime against the state.
It would be great if the Secret Service is keeping an eye on him, and just one little thing.
As I say, if I were the police chief of Williamsburg, I would be looking out every time he steps off the curb.
Jeez. Man. It is really something else. What a lot of people may not know about Hickley is that he does have tremendous financial resources at his disposal. His family has millions of dollars.
Oh, where does that money come from? Do you know, Kristin?
They ran an energy company.
Yeah, and I suspect, Kristin, that a lot of the reason that he was able to get off with an insanity defense was his family's financial resources.
Less lawyers money can buy, that sort of.
I mean, he certainly wasn't dependent on a public defender who had 30 other cases.
And it's a shame the prosecutors couldn't have rammed home an appropriate guilty verdict, because we all saw what happened. There it was on national television.
So I guess, in case I haven't completely answered your question from before, do I think he's dangerous? Probably not. Although I wouldn't be sure of it, but I think probably not. Is he despicable? Absolutely.
And the punishment of that troika that you mentioned, the three-legged stool of incarceration, punishment is a valid end in terms of if you've done something particularly heinous, which John Hinckley Jr. has.
Absolutely. This is an attempt, so far as is humanly possible in the case of murder or attempted murder, or malicious wounding, to balance the scales. We can't do it the way we'd like to. We can't bring the dead back to life or really balance the scales, but this is an attempt at proportionality. And I would submit to you that if you kill somebody, anything short of the death penalty is disproportionate in your favor.
I like that.
Good. I just made it up. Okay.
This may be referred to as the Olshaker formula down the road.
Fair enough.
I'm still shocked when people get out of jail 20 or 25 years, having been found guilty in some examples of murder. They don't even serve life without parole. For a quarter of a century, which admittedly is a long time. And as someone who's never been incarcerated.
And let me clear the air here. I think there are types of murder, specifically felony murder, where a murder is committed in the commission of another crime, like a robbery or something, where things happen very quickly. There may not have been any intent to kill or even harm. Somebody used a gun, they panicked, whatever. I think those people oftentimes can be rehabilitated. I think they should serve long sentences, and I think their lives should certainly be altered, and there should be some kind of attempt at restorative justice. But I would submit that people like that, you don't have to keep them in prison forever. 20 years or whatever is certainly enough time. But the people who intend to kill, who go about it in a planned, methodical way, who are sexual predators, who do it just for their own satisfaction, if you will, their own sexual needs or desires, these kind of people should never be let out on the street again, under any circumstances.
Yeah, this isn't somebody who...
Let me just say one more thing. We've written about, in our book Obsession, we wrote about the case of a 20-year-old woman named Stephanie Schmidt in Kansas, who shortly before her 21st birthday was abducted and raped and murdered by a co-worker who the parole board, her parole officer, had not wanted to let anybody know what his previous crime was, which was aggravated sexual assault with a knife. Now, he, I think, had been sentenced to 25 years. He was let out in about 10 or 12 or 15. And what he learned from being in prison was if you're going to commit this kind of crime again, you don't leave any witnesses to put you back in prison. So now we all know the formulation, which I believe originally came from the Reverend Increase Mather back in pre-colonial times, about it's better to let 100 guilty men go free to convict one innocent man. We all agree with that, and as we should. But let's turn that on its head. If you have 100 sexual predators, violent sexual predators who've been incarcerated, and you're going to let them out on parole, what's your acceptable rate of failure with 100 people? What percentage are you willing to concede, okay, they may go on to commit the same kind of crime or worse again? Is it 5%? Is it 3%? Is it 1%? I would submit to you that my acceptable rate of failure is 0%. That's why I'm very hesitant to let these kind of guys out of prison early.
I'm at 0. Kristin, where are you on that?
I'm a 0. Yeah, absolutely.
Because
absolutely.
And here's another thing that directly affects Kristin in a way that I'll explain in a minute. People ask John Douglas, can you tell who is going to grow up to be a serial killer? And he says, no, I can't tell you who's going to grow up to be a serial killer, but I can tell you by looking at kids whether they're going to grow up to have real problems with anger and aggression and all of that. And he said, but so can any good teacher.
Yeah, no, I agree. We ended up actually having a conversation very interestingly at the end of the year about kids that we had taught who went on to become criminals. If you've been in the profession long enough, you do invariably have some.
How disturbing.
Yeah.
Disturbing, but not surprising.
And yet at the same time, we can't incarcerate those kids as they're finishing up their year with you or whatever.
No, you try to intervene as best you can,
yes.
but often there's a lot of pushback to try from parents or other people who say you're stigmatizing them or whatever the problem.
Absolutely, it is. I want to make sure we get in a plug for at least one of your books. If you want to read more about John Hinckley, Mark David Chapman, Charles Whitman, and other shooters, there is a chapter in The Anatomy of Motive by John Douglas and Mark Olshaker that covers all of that information. And Mark, I know you said that there's a chapter in Obsession as well that covers that.
That covers the Stephanie Schmidt case, but also I would say our book, The Killer's Shadow, talks about Joseph Paul Franklin, who was, as far as we know, the first racist, anti-Semitic serial killer and definitely an assassin personality. Yeah, I think you'll get a lot of insight about this kind of personality through The Killer's Shadow.
And I know
our latest book, which we mentioned earlier, When a Killer Calls, also a very moving, tragic story, but an important one.
I think that was one of your best ones, actually.
Thank you.
And of course, we did cover that episode earlier in this year, which we will make sure we
listen to the podcast again, everybody.
We'll run it again.
Absolutely.
And Mark, I know it's always hard to predict when you've got multiple projects in development, but what do you think the next book to be released will be?
Gosh, I really don't know, but I'll confess something here. What I'd really like to do in my old age here is I'd like to go back to novel writing and see if I can still do it.
Really?
It's been quite a while since I've written a novel, but I've got 3 ideas, which I think are pretty compelling. And if I get time, I'd really like to go back to see if I can go back to fiction.
Our guest today has been Mark Olshaker. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. As always, it's a pleasure.
And always, it's a pleasure on this end too, Kristin.
Thank you very much. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.